Hey everyone, this is Lomi, and today we're going to be looking at sewing supplies and how to set up your first sewing kit. I'm recording this live, which is something new for me, so it'll either make everything a lot easier or make it a lot harder when I have to do more editing. What kind of supplies we'll see how it goes and what they're used for. So today I'm going to walk you through the supplies that I think are necessary when you're new, the bare minimum things that you need to be able to sew pretty much anything I show you on my channel. Even if you do a lot of machine sewing, you're always going to need hand sewing supplies. So obviously the first thing you're going to need is hand needles. A package like this, which is just assorted needles, assorted sizes, it's pretty much all you'll need. It includes a variety of needles from the sharps, which are usually up here, to quilting needles, which are smaller, shorter, and not quite as sharp. Needles with a very large eye, like these, are used for embroidery. And then down here, you have needles that are used for darning and repair, and anything that you might do using ribbon. The next thing that you'll want that should be really obvious is a good pair of scissors. I have fancy ones just because they're what I like, and also my great-grandmother used this brand. So I figure if it was good enough for her, then it's perfect for me. You can get by with dollar store scissors, just as long as they're sharp enough to cut fabric, and make sure that you only use your scissors for fabric. I keep scissors for fabric and scissors for paper completely separate so that they never get mixed up. Having a set of smaller scissors like these for trimming threads is completely optional, but these were a gift and I like having them handy. This is a sewing gauge, which comes with most kits available for beginners. It's got notches on one side that show the inches, and then over here is centimeters. This is really useful when sewing in doll scale because you can use the slider to make sure that your hems are the correct size. You can use it to mark buttonholes. It's really versatile for really tiny scale sewing, and I try to keep one of these with me all the time. Then there's the seam ripper. This is going to be your best friend, and while I just use a little cheap one because I'm constantly losing them, there are some really beautiful ones available too. You use this anytime you mess something up and have to take your stitches back out, which I do a lot of. They last pretty well, and this is one that I have had for at least 10 years that I've somehow not lost yet. I've had a lot of others that were nicer that have come and gone, but this one still sticks around. They stay sharp a long time as long as you only use them for thread. If you use them for anything else, they'll dull down and you'll have to replace them fairly often. So you'll definitely want some sewing pens. These are super cheap ones that I got on eBay and I hate them. So make sure you get something that is steel. These are an alloy, which is really soft, and I am constantly bending them. You can see that there's a bent one right here. Most of them are sharp, so they're okay, but I would really prefer to have something sturdier. And it's also important to make sure that if you get a pen with a head, get something that has a glass head on it. These are plastic, which means that I can't iron anything that has these pins in them because these will melt if the iron so much as brushes against them. I have had to pull these off of fabric before, and that's not fun. You will want a thimble. You might think that this is for keeping your fingers from being poked when you're going through the fabric, and that's not really it. You usually wear your thimble on the middle finger, and it's actually used for pushing the needle through the fabric. Oh, mine's metal, but plastic is fine too. You will want a good measuring tape. This one was from a bead supply company. It was a free gift with a purchase. I used to make jewelry a long time ago. I've got a little sticker on there. I'm actually a really big fan of The Last Blade. I used to play fighting games a lot. I know that's kind of a random thing. This has inches on one side and centimeters on the other, and it's also extremely flexible and self-retractable, so this is really useful for doll scale. You want to make sure that it has centimeters on one side because when working in doll scale, you'll use centimeters most often. For marking patterns, it's a good idea to have a water-soluble pencil. These come with most starter kits, but they're also available on their own. These disappear as soon as you wash something, so it's great for marking fabrics, when you're working with dark fabric especially. On light colored fabrics, I recommend Pilot friction pins. These erase with heat, so if you run an iron over something after you've sewn it, the marks from this pin will completely disappear. Thread is something that should be really obvious, but there's a little bit to it that you don't really think about when you're getting started. I have a sewing class that I attend, and the teacher there has been sewing for longer than I have been alive, and it was only in this past year that she finally learned there is a difference between serger thread and normal sewing thread. Normal sewing thread is 3-ply, which means it's actually 3 tiny threads twisted together. While serger thread, which comes on big cones like this, is 2-ply. This means it's thinner and it's not quite as strong. If you were sewing for human clothing, you probably wouldn't want to use this on anything that was going to be getting a lot of wear, but if you're working with doll clothes, this is usually plenty. It's great because a big cone like this is way less expensive than if you were trying to get a whole lot of thread, but it doesn't come in as many colors. A cone like this costs about $3 or $4 in the United States, while a tiny little spool like this is almost $3 on its own. So if you can get basic colors in this, then for doll sewing, it's really pretty economical. The only catch is that you have to make sure your sewing machine can hold it. Mine has the spool feed on the top, so I can slide the cone on with no problem. If you only have space for a spool like this, then you might need to be creative, but you can put this in a coffee cup behind your sewing machine and still thread it like normal. So aside from fabric, these are the things that I think are absolutely necessary for getting started sewing. If you have these, you can make pretty much anything. But there is one other thing that I do think is fairly important that I do think is worth mentioning, and that is pinking shears. If you don't have the means to finish the edge of what you're sewing, pinking shears can be a lifesaver. They cut in a zigzag pattern, and that reduces the chances of fabric fraying. This is great for doll clothes, which aren't going to be washed very often. So if you don't have the option of a zigzag stitch or an overedge stitch, these can be a lifesaver. You don't need as much to get started with a sewing machine, but there are a few small recommendations I would make for somebody just getting a sewing machine set up. You will want to make sure you have extra bobbins. I keep one of these for every color of thread I have and then some. Anytime you get bobbins for your sewing machine, you have to make sure they're compatible. Generally speaking, if your sewing machine comes with metal bobbins or plastic bobbins, you want to stick with what it came with. However, my machine says that it's compatible with both plastic and metal bobbins, so I tend to get the metal ones because they're sturdier and hold up better for me long term. You'll probably want to get a pack of universal needles, which can be used on just about any fabric. Your machine will come with these, but you want to change your needle about every 8 hours of sewing, so it's good to have extras on hand. The other recommendation I would make is getting a pack of stretch needles. While the universal needles can be used for sewing things like knit fabrics and spandex, you almost always get better results using the stretch needles. They're made specifically for it, and they will reduce your number of skipped stitches. Sometimes using the wrong needle for your project can mess up your thread tension, and that's a headache you just really don't want to mess with. If you want to get a sewing machine, you don't need anything fancy. As long as your sewing machine can go forwards, backwards, make buttonholes, and do a zigzag stitch, you can make very professional looking garments. So the last thing we're going to look at for today is fabric. While I use a big variety of fabrics, most of the time you're going to be doing your sewing with basic cotton. This is your basic cotton fabric, which is the same on both sides because it was woven that way. But if you've watched my sewing videos before, you've probably heard me say things like right side and wrong side together. That usually means the right side versus the wrong side of your garment, but you can also see that some fabrics have a right side and a wrong side as well. This is a print fabric where the pattern was actually stamped on. So while there's a clear pattern on one side, it's very washed out and pale on the other. These are sometimes made with ink or paint or dye, but they have a very pale side, which is usually what you want against your doll because it reduces the chance of staining. Another thing to notice about this particular piece of fabric is that this is the selvage. That's a really weird word that developed from self-finished edge, which eventually became self-edge, which became selvage. This is the finished edge, which is woven so tightly that it won't ravel. While most of the time you cut them off, the selvage can be really useful for working with tiny dolls. You can see this side of the fabric, the pattern goes pretty much to the edge. That means you could make this the bottom edge of a piece of clothing, and you wouldn't have to do anything to finish it. The way it is now, it won't ravel. Every fabric has a grain. It's usually more visible on the wrong side. So you can see there are lines running this way and this way. Sometimes you'll have pieces for patterns that include a line down the middle of the piece. Something kind of like this. This is your grain line. That means to make sure your pieces are straight, you want to line this up parallel with the grain in the fabric. This ensures your pieces are straight. However, if you're using a fabric like this, where the pattern is stamped on, you sometimes have to make a decision. Either you can line it up square with the grain of the fabric, or you can line it up to be square with the pattern. Because just because this is stamped doesn't mean it was stamped straight. So it's important to decide whether you want to be square with your fabric or square with your pattern. There's another kind of cut that you can do, which is called bias cut. When you cut on the bias, it means you've turned the fabric diagonally, so that you're running this way and this way against the grain. Fabric that's cut on the bias tends to be a little bit stretchier, flexible, but that's not always a good thing. You can get a better fit whenever you're going through tight curves like this, but if you want your garment to be very straight and very square, a bias cut isn't always best. But it does have the advantage of not fraying as easily, so that's one plus. And that's all for today. In the near future, I'll teach you a little bit about sewing by hand to get you started if you don't have a machine yet. Otherwise, if you do have a machine, I've already got several tutorials up that are beginner friendly, and you can get started with those today. Thanks for joining me again, and if you have any questions about anything I showed you today, feel free to leave a comment below and I'll answer it as best I can. Thanks for joining me again. Bye.